Have you ever felt as though your mind keeps circling the same point, endlessly orbiting a thought, a memory, a fear, a hope? You sit with it, you try to move past it, but like a planet held in the gravity of an unseen sun, you're pulled back again. Not just once, but over and over. At first it seems like introspection. Then it begins to distort. And before long, the loop swallows time. It devours clarity. And you start to question whether it's really you doing the thinking at all, or whether you've stumbled into a looped script inside some deeper program, a simulation within your own consciousness. The thought loop. It is not simply overthinking, nor is it merely anxiety dressed in mental repetition. No, this loop is something far more architectural. It is the scaffolding of a cage, disguised as self-reflection. A corridor with mirrors on both sides stretching into infinity. It whispers like your own voice, but its tone is slightly off, like a dream you can't wake up from, yet swear you've dreamt before. It is the phantom repetition that coats your sense of identity, cycling between past regrets and imagined futures, never quite letting you touch the now. And this loop is not accidental. It is engineered perhaps not by shadowy technocrats, but by something even more persistent, a pattern, a hidden programming ancient as thought itself, passed down through generations, taught through culture, echoed by trauma, and etched into the neural architecture by sheer habit. And just like a computer caught in a recursive process, your mind spins its wheels, burning energy without movement, noise without progress. But here's the unspoken truth: many are trapped, and few even realize it. Because the loop doesn't look like a trap. It masquerades as analysis, as ambition, as self-improvement, even love. You might think, I just need to understand this one thing, or if I figure this out, it'll all make sense. Yet every solution the loop offers feeds the loop. It's a hall of doors, each promising an exit, but they all open back into the same room. Now, pause, breathe, ask yourself, who is watching this loop? Who stands behind the thoughts? Therein lies the seed of escape. Because the simulation, the one you may be trapped in, is not necessarily a virtual one built by machines. It is a simulation of self, of identity, of assumed limitations and narratives looping in the background of consciousness. This simulation isn't something you were tricked into. You helped build it. Every unexamined belief, every unquestioned fear, every story you've repeated to yourself for comfort or justification, it laid bricks in the architecture of this looping world. But that's not a condemnation. It's an invitation. Because if you helped build the loop, then you can also unbuild it. If you programmed part of the simulation, then you can begin to rewrite the code. And to be clear, we are not just speaking of mental habits in the way a therapist might. This isn't about thinking positively or redirecting your focus. No, we're about to descend into something deeper, where mind meets myth, where memory overlaps with dream, and where your thoughts don't just influence your life, they generate the illusion of it. You see, the simulation is not a place. It is a rhythm, a pattern of mental, emotional, and perceptual repetitions so smooth, so seamless, that they become invisible. And within that rhythm, you lose your sense of the conductor. The music plays itself, the story writes itself, and you forget that the page was always blank until you imagined ink. And so, the loop becomes sacred, not because it is true, but because it feels real. It becomes your God, your ghost, your guide. Every decision you make, whom you love, what you fear, where you go, is filtered through that persistent vibration. Like a song you can't stop humming, even though you don't know where you first heard it. But you can stop. You can wake up not just in the spiritual sense, but in the neurological, the emotional, the deeply human sense. You can shatter the false continuity. You can disturb the pattern enough to to see the seams in its surface. And once you see the seams, you realize this isn't you. This was never you. You are the one observing all of this, and the observer is not bound by the loop. The observer is free, and that realization, that subtle, trembling, awakening truth is the first crack in the glass. A light begins to bleed in. You don't yet know what's outside the loop, but for the first time you suspect there is an outside. This journey we're about to embark on isn't linear. There will be no direct ladder upward, no bullet-pointed escape plan. Instead, we'll dance through the underlayers of perception. We'll unravel symbols, confront the guardians of false memory, and find where the simulation overlays the sacred. We will walk backward through the illusion until we stand face to face with the one who has been dreaming it all. To break the loop, we must first learn its language, not the surface language of words and feelings, but the hidden syntax, the unspoken code that underlies the architecture of the mind. This section is not about solutions yet. It is about peeling back the curtain and gazing into the machinery that keeps the loop alive. Because the simulation does not maintain itself through force. It persists through familiarity, through unquestioned rhythm, through the illusion of permanence. At its core, the loop is born from the marriage of memory and expectation. Memory builds the archive. Expectation writes the forecast. Together, they script your present. You are not reacting to life as it unfolds, not truly. You are reacting to echoes of what has already happened, projected forward onto a screen of what might be. Your thoughts swing like a pendulum between the residue of yesterday and the ghost of tomorrow. And the present, this elusive golden thread, is lost in that motion. What sustains the simulation is not data, but meaning. Your mind is a storyteller, and it craves narrative cohesion. It cannot bear the void. So, when something uncertain or painful occurs, your mind builds a story, an explanation, a pattern. But here's the twist. The mind doesn't necessarily seek truth. It seeks completion, closure. And once it finds a narrative that fits, even if imperfectly, it runs it like a looped program, hoping that repetition will provide relief. This is how the simulation begins. A thought occurs, I failed. It links with a memory, I've failed before. It predicts a future, I'll fail again. The loop closes. The story hardens. The thought becomes belief. The belief shapes perception. And perception sculpts reality not objectively, but in the only way you can experience it subjectively. You do not see the world as it is. You see it as you are. Or rather, as your loop tells you you are. Another foundational concept is the illusion of identity. Most people believe they are thinking their thoughts. But the deeper you go, the more you realize you are not the thinker. You are the space in which thinking occurs. The thoughts are guests, but they have overstayed. The simulation convinces you that you are your memories, your traumas, your plans, your regrets. But this is a mask worn by a deeper self, a self that existed before you knew your name. This simulation thrives in linearity. Past, present, future, cause and effect, action and reaction. And yet, time, at least as the loop presents, it is not real in the way we assume. Thoughts don't always obey chronology. A childhood wound can shape a present panic. A future fear can paralyze a current decision. And sometimes, all three past, present, future collapse into a single mental state. That is the loop. It is not just circular, it is folded. It traps you in layers, wrapping one illusion inside another, like a cosmic Russian doll. The loop's power intensifies through emotion. Emotions are not weaknesses. They are powerful energy currents. But when emotion is fused to thought, especially negative or fear-based thought, It anchors that thought deeper into your reality. Now, it isn't just I am alone. Now, it feels true. It's embodied. It becomes your posture, your decisions, your tone of voice. The simulation is no longer just mental. It's become visceral. And what role does resistance play in all this? A massive one. The harder you try to escape a thought, the more you feed it. You wrestle with the loop, and it grows stronger. Like a Chinese finger trap, the way out is not force, it is paradox. Letting go, shifting awareness. The loop thrives on your attempt to control it, to solve it. But it was never meant to be solved in the analytical sense. The loop is a koan, not a riddle. It unravels through presence, not through logic. Here is where the simulation begins to feel spiritual. Because beneath the recurring thought patterns, the fragmented identities, the timelines and emotions, there is something untouched, a stillness, a witness. The loop may be loud, but this presence is silent. The loop may feel infinite, but this presence is eternal. And unlike the loop which traps you in becoming, this presence exists in being. The more you recognize this, the more cracks form in the simulation. The more you feel it, not think it, but feel it, the more the loop dissolves. Like a dream in daylight, this presence is your natural state. The loop is the dream, but the dream is so vivid, so deeply woven, that it feels more real than truth. And so, we keep choosing it. Not because we are weak, but because the dream is familiar. It's warm in its own way. It's predictable, but it is also finite, and the soul longs for infinity. As we move forward, we will begin to trace the deeper symbolic narratives hidden within this structure. Because every thought loop contains an archetype, a myth playing itself out, under the guise of your personal story. And once you see the myth, you are no longer just a character in it. You become the author. To truly understand the nature of the thought loop, we must now abandon the clinical lens of analysis and step into the mythic realm, where symbols breathe, where metaphors whisper truths older than language, and where the story of your mind is not yours alone, but a chapter in a much older tale written in cosmic ink. Imagine, if you will, a labyrinth. Not just any labyrinth, but one etched in the folds of your own brain. A shifting maze of synaptic corridors, neural echoes, and mirrored turns. You, the wanderer, awaken at the center of this maze, clutching a half-burned map and a vague memory of a door you've never seen yet somehow remember. Every path you take loops back to the same stone bench, the same cracked tile, the same question. This is the myth of the eternal return, an ancient story echoed through every civilization in one form or another. That human consciousness, left unexamined, repeats its steps, like a ghost haunting its own footprints. Not out of punishment, but because it cannot yet see the exit. The exit exists, but it's disguised. It is not hidden outside the labyrinth, but within your way of walking it. The thought loop is your labyrinth, and you are both the prisoner and the architect. Another symbol emerges here, the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. It is the perfect emblem of self-consuming thought. You bite into an idea, a memory, a what if, and instead of digesting it and moving on, you begin feeding on yourself. Round and round you go, mistaking motion for meaning. But the Ouroboros, in its paradox, also holds a secret rebirth. The very act of consuming itself can be the seed of transformation. If one recognizes the cycle as a symbol, not a sentence, then comes the mirror. The loop is always reflective. It reflects your fears, your desires, your assumptions. But the mirror is warped. It shows you not how things are, but how you believe they are. And if you stare long enough into this mirror, you begin to think, this is who I am. But mirrors don't show truth. They show images. You are not the reflection. You are the one watching the reflection. And if you break the mirror, not with violence, but with silence, you may find the face behind it was never yours to begin with. Let us bring in the tale of the dreaming prisoner. And this prisoner sits in a cell carved from thought. Each bar a belief, each wall a memory reinforced by years of repetition. He dreams he is free. He dreams he escapes. But each time he wakes, he is still in the cell. One day, he stops dreaming escape and begins to observe the dream itself. He sees the bars are transparent. The door has no lock. The guards are shadows made of expectation. And in that stillness, without resistance, without struggle, he steps forward, and the prison dissolves like fog in the sun. The loop feeds on your forgetting. It needs you to forget that you are not your role, not your pain, not your name, even. It needs you to forget the deeper layers, the watcher, the eternal, the part of you that was never born and cannot be harmed. And so, the myth that liberates is not one of heroic battle, but of quiet remembrance. You've heard this myth in disguised forms: the Matrix, Plato's cave, the Lotus Eaters. Each story, a breadcrumb left for you by those who glimpsed beyond. Not allegories of entertainment, but encoded blueprints, messages from your deeper self, whispered through symbols. The loop also hides behind the archetype of the wounded healer. You keep revisiting the same trauma, not just to relive it, but to try subconsciously to heal it. But healing does not come through repetition. It comes through witnessing. The loop makes you the patient endlessly, but never the physician, until one day, you stop asking, why did this happen to me? And begin asking, who is it that this happened to? And in that reversal, the wound becomes a window. Light enters. The loop stutters. In ancient stories, the only way out of a cursed forest is not to run in circles, but to walk differently, to chant the name of your true self, to carry a flame that the shadows fear. These are not just fantasy metaphors. They are instructions. They are reminders, because the loop fears one thing above all: the return of your awareness. So the simulation gives you tasks, distractions, endless errands of the mind. It makes you busy, it makes you forget. But every now and then, in moments of silence, the symbolic cracks through. A sudden déjà vu, a dream with impossible clarity, a wordless ache. These are not malfunctions, they are messages. The loop, trying to alert you to itself. You may even sense this now, that some part of you already knows this, that you've always known, that you've been leaving signs for yourself along the way. A book that shook you, a conversation that opened you, a glance that felt infinite. These are not coincidences, they are constellations. They mark the way out. And so before we move forward, ask yourself, what if your looping thoughts are not brokenness, but invitations? What if each cycle is the echo of a lesson waiting not to be solved, but integrated? Because now, we move to the terrain where metaphor meets reality, where myths become movements, where the looping thought no longer imprisons, but points. The celestial metaphors may awaken something inside you, a flicker of knowing, a recognition, but without embodiment, even the most radiant insight becomes another ghost in the hall of mirrors. Now we descend from the mythic stratosphere and plant our feet gently on the soil of the everyday. This is where transformation either becomes real or evaporates into another loop of philosophical indulgence. How then does one begin to live beyond the simulation? Start here. Awareness is the key, but attention is the doorway. The loop does not need your consent to exist. It only needs your unconscious participation. The moment you become aware that a thought is repeating, that a belief has coiled itself into a pattern, you are already standing outside of it. Not far outside, perhaps, but enough to observe it rather than be it. But this awareness must be practiced, like a craft. Consider your attention a sacred lantern and the loop, a shadow that cannot survive light. Throughout your day, moments will come. A trigger, a memory, a sudden swell of emotion, followed by a tidal wave of inner commentary. The loop begins its chant. Why did they say that I'm not good enough? This always happens. But instead of being pulled into the current, you pause. You notice. You label gently, not with judgment, but with curiosity. The loop. Even naming it weakens it. But naming alone is not liberation. You must then anchor yourself not in analysis, not in logic, but in the now. Your body becomes the anchor. The senses become your compass. Feel your feet, your breath, the air brushing your skin. These are not just mindfulness tricks. These are reality's way of reminding you. You exist outside the loop. The simulation cannot mimic sensation. It only traffics in mental echoes. Next, embrace the radical act of slowing down. The loop thrives in speed and mental quicksand. It loves reaction, especially unexamined reaction. It feeds on urgency, but slowness is subversive. When you slow your breath, your words, your movements, you signal to your system, I am not in danger. And when the body no longer believes it is under attack, the loop loses its leverage. There's power too in ritual interruption. Not grand ceremonies, but tiny intentional shifts. A cold splash of water when the loop begins. A few deep audible exhales. A conscious change of environment, a walk outside, a shift in posture, an unscripted action. These break the inertia. They jolt the system, not because the action itself is magical, but because you've chosen it. Choice is the currency of freedom. And still deeper, learn to dialogue with the loop. Not to fight it, fighting is more looping, but to sit with it, like an ancient guest who speaks in riddles. Ask it, what are you trying to protect? What wound are you circling? Often the loop is not your enemy, but your subconscious attempting to process pain. With the only tools it has: repetition, prediction, preparation. By acknowledging it, even honoring its attempt, you begin to integrate it. And what is integrated no longer controls. This brings us to an uncomfortable but liberating truth. The loop may not disappear, but your relationship to it can transform so deeply that it no longer traps you. It becomes background noise, a minor weather system in your sky. You no longer confuse it with reality. You no longer build shrines to it. It no longer decides the direction of your life. And so, we begin making decisions from a new place, not the loop, but the witness. What does that look like in daily life? It looks like refusing to text someone from a place of emotional spiraling, like choosing stillness instead of the impulse to explain yourself, like hearing the voice that says, this won't work out, and gently responding with, maybe it will. You reclaim space. You reclaim the pauses between thoughts. And in those pauses, you begin to remember. Remember what it's like to exist without being defined by commentary. Remember the child within you who once existed without stories of limitation. Remember the version of yourself who responded to the world not with defense or control, but with wonder. This reclamation doesn't happen all at once, but every moment you notice the loop and choose otherwise, even for a second, you bend the structure. You teach your nervous system that it doesn't have to obey the old rhythm. You create a new rhythm. And over time, that rhythm becomes your reality. And what of relationships? The loop often masquerades in connection, projection, control assumptions. You must begin to see where your mental loops are scripting the other person before they've even spoken. Are you responding to them? or to a simulation of them your mind has constructed, based on old loops. If the latter, pause, wipe the lens, speak to the soul, not the avatar. Finally, understand this. The simulation is not something to destroy. It is something to transcend. You don't break the loop by tearing it down. You outgrow it. You see through it. You stop dancing to its music. And then, like a hologram exposed by shifted light, it flickers and fades. Not with fanfare, but with grace. And now, here you are, standing at the threshold, looking back, not at a single path, but at the entire fractal field of your inner terrain. You have wandered through fog and metaphor, logic and stillness, myth and breath, and perhaps something has begun to soften, to shift, not as a blinding revelation, but as a slow turning of the soul toward its own source. You've seen now that the loop was never just a mental quirk, nor merely a flaw in cognition. It was a sacred teacher, disguised as repetition. It was the echo of the unprocessed, the signal of the unintegrated, the whisper of a self you abandoned, but never lost. You believed you were trapped, and you were, but the trap had no locks. The bars were made of thoughts, pretending to be truths. The simulation does not collapse in a dramatic implosion. It unravels in quiet choices. Each time you refuse to believe the voice that says you are stuck. Each time you shift your gaze from the storm to the stillness. Each time you act from presence rather than reaction. You rewrite the code, not for some future version of you, but for the you that has always existed beyond the loop. And what does that you feel like? It's not something you can summarize or define, because it lives in the space before definition. It is the stillness between thoughts, the quiet recognition in a long gaze, the knowing that doesn't shout, the peace that needs no explanation. It is what remains when the simulation no longer compels you, when your mind is no longer the master, but the instrument, when the stories lose their grip, and what's left is simply being. The final illusion to pierce is that this loop is unique to you. It is not. Every being in this world carries their own version of it. Some loops are loud and frantic, others are quiet and dignified. Some are ancestral, woven into bloodlines. Others are born from trauma or repetition or mere survival, but they are all masks over the same face, the face of consciousness, exploring itself through temporary forgetting. And so, the work you do here is not only for yourself. Every time you break even one thread of the loop, you send a ripple into the field. You become a pattern interrupt in the collective trance. You offer a new rhythm, a new signal, and others feel it whether they know it or not. One flame doesn't just illuminate its own wick, it offers fire to the darkness around it. This is not spiritual romance, it is a quiet revolution. The world needs fewer people shouting over their loops, and more people listening beneath them. Fewer quick fixes and more slow remembrance. Less optimization, more presence. Less identity, more awareness. So now ask yourself, not with urgency, but with reverence, what happens if I stop trying to fix the loop and start listening to it? What if every repeating thought is an old part of me, knocking at the door, asking not to be destroyed, but reintegrated? What if I stop trying to exit the simulation like a prisoner and instead rise above it like a lucid dreamer? You are not here to escape your mind. You are here to become conscious within it. And as you do, the landscape changes. The script wavers. The voices quiet. The sky bends open. You find yourself not in a different world, but seeing this one clearly for the first time. And in that clarity, you no longer search for the door. You are the door. You always were. So go not as someone breaking out, but as someone breaking through. Walk slowly, speak truthfully, hold your gaze steady, and remember, the simulation was never stronger than your awareness. It only survived because you forgot to look. But now, you are looking, you are awake, and the loop is ending.